Thank you very much. This is an unusual talk for you, I imagine, because I'm going to give you a narrative history. And this is something that is a little unusual for me, but probably even more unusual for you. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, my co-author, Diana Magnuson, who worked on this with me. And so I'm just going to give you the highlights of a few political incidents and a broad sweep of institutional change in the Census Bureau, and particularly in census data capture over the period from 1790 to 2020. If you're interested and you want more detail, Diana and I have a working paper on this topic available on the Minnesota Population Center website, and you can go there to get more. So we're focusing in particular on data capture. And data capture we define as the methods and technologies used to transform raw census responses into statistical tables. So, and by focusing on the federal responses to the challenges of data capture over a very long run, we get to see how politics interacts with bureaucratic decision making, and it's pretty interesting. So here's our thesis, that for a very long period the U.S. Census was the leading edge of data processing technology. The changes in politics, of course, influenced the content of the census and the uses to which it was put, but also influenced the methods that were used to capture the census in the first place. But unfortunately, since the 1990s, privatization of the data capture process has led to a near disaster, as I will describe. So there's 5 major eras we define in the history of census data capture. Historians like to have periodization, so this is our periodization, and we will start with decentralized tabulation. So this guy is James Madison. You know him as the architect of the Constitution. He was also the architect of the U.S. Census. He proposed 2 census schedules, a demographic schedule and an occupational schedule. The occupational schedule is going to specify the number of persons employed in different professions and arts, including merchants, mechanics, manufacturers, but it was defeated amidst concern that it would excite the jealousy of the people and was just gratifying an idle curiosity. Madison wrote to Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the guy responsible for the census because that's what the Secretary of State did then. He wrote, "It was thrown out of the Senate as a waste of trouble and supplying materials for idle people to make a book." So this is the form he came up with, the 1790 census form. There was no printed form. All the enumerators had to draw up their own form, but the layout was pretty much the same everywhere. And there's just 5 questions. The first column, and so each line represents a household. The first column is the number of men age 16 and over. The second one is number of boys under 16. The third one is number of white women. Those are both whites as well. And then all other free persons, that is non-white free persons, and then the number of slaves. So you can see this is a highly efficient design. Just to give you an example here, so we've got William Woody up there on the, have I got a button here? But anyway, William Woody's on the top line. He's in a household with 1 adult male and 1 adult female. Then the second William Woody, underneath him, 1 adult male, 1 adult female, and 5 young men under the age of 16. So he's probably his son. But what makes this so efficient is, see up here, it says brought over. Well, this is from the previous page. These are the totals, and they added up the number of people in each of these categories, and then down at the bottom, there's a new running total, and then that's brought forward to the next line. So what this meant was that there was almost no need for any tabulation in Washington. They just were able to send the totals in. All of the work was done by the enumerators out in the field, by the census marshals, and it was very efficient. So the census grew rapidly from 1790 to 1840. It went from these 5 questions up to 80 columns. And this is the 1840 census form. And you can see it's very detailed. The columns are quite cramped. They're 3/8 of an inch by 3/8 of an inch, each little square. But it's just like the 1790 form. It's the number of people with various different characteristics. It was so this led to a lot of errors, the most famous of which involved the questions on insanity and idiocy, which led to the downfall of this form of the census. So over there on the far right of the form, there were 2 columns for insane or idiotic whites, and then 2 more columns for insane or idiotic colored people. They distinguish between insane at the public charge and not at the public charge. And at any rate, what was discovered was that the farther you went north, the more insanity there was. Just 1 in 14 in Maine. By the time you get to Louisiana, it's 1 in 4,000. And of course, the advocates of slavery jumped on this as evidence for the necessity of slavery. So this is John C. Calhoun. In all instances in which the states have changed the former relation between the 2 races, the condition of the African, instead of being improved, has become worse. They have sunk into vice and pauperism, accompanied by bodily and mental inflictions incident thereto, including insanity and idiocy. Here is the proof of the necessity of slavery. The African is incapable of self-care and sinks into lunacy under the burden of freedom. Well, Edward Jarvis, he was a physician and statistician in Massachusetts. He looked into this a little more deeply and wrote a monograph called Insanity Among the Colored Population. Here's a page from that. And you note in Maine there, up on the upper left, these are all different towns in Maine, and you can see that the number of colored insane consistently exceeds the number of colored inhabitants. And in many cases, many towns have quite a few colored insane with no colored inhabitants whatsoever. And so Jarvis realized what had happened. People make random errors over there on the right of the form and get things in the colored column that occasionally in the white column. It doesn't make any difference. They do this in the north and they do in the south, but in the south it doesn't make any difference because the denominator is so much bigger. In the north, there's no black population to speak of. They're very rare, and so just a few random errors of whites getting in the black column will give you this apparent relationship. So Jarvis said, this carries on its face its own refutation. It would have been far better to have had no census at all than such a one has been published, John Quincy Adams, who was then a representative, and he is the ex-president. He was in the House of Representatives. Calhoun writhed like a trodden rattlesnake on the exposure of his false report to the House that no material errors have been discovered in the census of 1840. This is what he wrote in his diary. So that's kind of fun. Okay, so this led to the end of the decentralized tabulation system, and Jarvis was part of a committee that redesigned the census form, but that created another big problem. So this is the census form they came up with. This is the free population form. There were 6 forms, but this was the main one. We went from 40 columns down to 13 columns. But the big change is that instead of each row representing a household, now each row represents an individual. And because of this, you can have responses that are not just numeric responses. So instead of having just like 4 or 5 occupational titles that were available in 1840, now we have every single individual's actual written out occupation. The first one up there is a malt manufacturer. Then he's got a cook living in his household. There's a couple of brewers, and so on. And then we've got the exact place of birth. We've got exact age instead of 5-year groups. And so there's much, much more detail. We still have room for the deaf, dumb, blind, insane, pauper, or convict over on the right-hand column. But we also have new questions like value of property, married within year, school attendance, and literacy. So how do you tabulate this? You can't tabulate this in the field the way they did before, because you've got to classify all of these different categories and classify the malt manufacturers into an occupational category. And that requires expertise. And so they did it on what they called spreadsheets or condensing sheets. They did it with hash marks, basically. And so there were 7 of these condensing sheets, each of which had about 10 tables on it. So every piece of paper, there were 700,000 paper forms with 42 families, 42 people on each form. Each one of those 700,000 forms had to be tallied with hash marks 7 times for the 7 different condensing sheets. So to do this work, the Census Bureau, the Census Office, it wasn't the Census Bureau yet, created a pop-up tabulating operation of unprecedented scale. By the end of 1851, the Washington office had a total of 170 staff, which was 10% of the entire federal workforce in Washington, and 9 times the number that had been required to tabulate the 1840 census. So the tabulation work wasn't completed for the 1850 tabulation work until 1859. The Census Bureau tried looking for new technologies. In 1872, Charles W. Seton, who was the chief clerk of the census, invented this device, the Seton device. And basically you take a spreadsheet and you wrap it around all these rollers so that you can get your hash marks closer to one another, and allowed you to tally 8 categories at once. It wasn't really that good. He got a $15,000 bonus because his boss, Francis Walker, made a petition to Congress that it had saved 29 person years of a clerk's work, and that was the salary of 29 clerks. But subsequent analysis has suggested that this was grossly exaggerated. It didn't work, and as you can see, the number of peak census office staff doing tabulation continued to rise until by 1880 it was almost 1,500. And yet, the 1880 census didn't get fully tabulated until 1888, and Census Superintendent William Rush Merriam said, "It's clear that a point must be reached before more decades had passed, where complete tabulation before the next enumeration began would actually be impossible." So that brings us to our next historical era, the unit record machines from 1890 to 1950. So in order to deal with this problem, the Census Office decided to have a contest, the 1889 Census Contest. And 3 inventors submitted their solutions. They're all based on the same idea. The first was Charles F. Pidgeon. He was chief clerk of the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics, and he developed a system using cardboard chips printed in different colors. Census information was transcribed onto the chips using symbols to represent different characteristics, and then the chips could be sorted into different piles, and you count the piles and make your tables that way, instead of using the hash marks. William C. Hunt had a simplified version of the Pidgeon system, where instead of using the colored chips, he used slips of paper, and instead of using different colored paper, he used colored inks. And so it was cheaper to implement, but not as good. And then there was, of course, Herman Hollerith. Hollerith had worked for the census in 1880. He understood what the problems of tabulation were, but he was an engineer, and he decided to make a machine for electric tabulation of cards with holes punched in the cards. So here's the results of the 1889 census contest. In the transcription phase, making the cards, or the slips, or the chips, Hollerith had a little bit of an advantage, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was in the tabulation phase where Hollerith was far, far better than the competition. And so overall, he managed to tabulate the test case of 10,491 residents in St. Louis in less than half the time as the other two. So this made a big splash. He made the cover of Scientific American, and there were two key elements to it: the key punch machine, and then the tabulating machine. I got these a series of photos from the Franklin Institute that I think have Hollerith in them. I think that's Hollerith, but I'm not absolutely sure. But they kind of illustrate how this works. So there's this press. It's kind of like a waffle iron. And first you put the punch card into the press. Here's the key punch machine. There's the card. They actually called it a keyboard for designating individual records. And then you close the box, pulling the pin box of spring-loaded pins. And so it's kind of like this waffle iron thing. And over on the right, you can see a cross-section of the pins. There's mercury cups. And wherever there's a spring-loaded pin hits a hole, it goes into the cup, makes a connection, and that makes an electromagnet advance dial counter. And in addition, open a door on the card sorter, and the operator inserts the card into the box. So that's the way it worked. It was highly successful in 1890. In 1896, Hollerith established a company, the Tabulating Machine Company. In 1900, the census was processed with equipment that was rented from Hollerith. It was extremely expensive. It worked out to something like $500,000 rental, which was a lot of money in those days. So the Hollerith started selling his machines to businesses. This is the Hollerith Type 3 in 1921. And then there's the Hollerith name. And then you can see there's a very similar machine, but now this is an IBM Type 285 in 1933. The Hollerith company changed its name to IBM in 1923. And this is the acme, the pinnacle of unit record machines was the Model 407, came out in 1949. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the Census Machine Shop. In 1902, the Census Bureau was made a permanent agency. Prior to that time, it was a pop-up thing that happened every 10 years, except it was pretty much going continuously because it was taking them so long to do the tabulation. But they realized that they needed a permanent Census Bureau, that this was highly inefficient. So anyway, in 1905, the first Census Bureau director, North, obtained $40,000 from Congress to set up a machine shop. And he hired a bunch of engineers from Hollerith and began production of its own tabulation equipment in direct competition with Hollerith. Now, you got to keep in mind, this is the progressive era, and Hollerith was seen as a trust. They had a monopoly. They had a monopoly over this thing, and they were charging exorbitant prices. The patents for Hollerith's original machinery were going to expire in 1906, and so the Census Bureau decided to go into direct competition with Hollerith and make their own equipment. And to do this, they hired, in addition to a bunch of engineers from the Hollerith company, they hired this guy, James Powers, and he developed new punch card machines at the Census Bureau, evading the Hollerith patents. He left, and so they did the 1910 census, then he left in 1911 and established the Powers Accounting Machine Company. And Powers This is an ad on the left for the Powers punch card system. It became the Remington-Rand punch card system in 1950. So from 1910 to 1950, the census was primarily done on machines that were actually built in the Census Bureau, in the Census machine shop. It had different names. It eventually got called the Engineering Division. Here's a 1920 card sorter. Here's the Census Mechanical Laboratory. That's what they were calling it in the 1950s. Those guys are building machinery for tabulation. This is a shot of tabulating the 1940 census entirely on machines built by the Census Bureau. And this is the last generation of Census Bureau mechanical tabulators in 1950. So this is a Scientific American. So in 1946, IBM hired the Census Bureau chief of machine tabulation, and then they came out with a new machine that was based on Census Bureau designs. And it was called a super duper census gadget in popular science. And the irony here is, so the Census Bureau in 1906, essentially steals the intellectual property of Hollerith in order to make their own machines so they don't have to rent stuff from Hollerith. And then 40 years later, IBM, the descendant of Hollerith, goes and steals Census Bureau technology and actually manages to make machines, and they rented 32 of these machines to IBM to tabulate the 1950 census. So what goes around comes around. But anyway, there is a third Census Bureau startup, the Eckert Mauchly Computer Corporation. Eckert and Mauchly had made ENIAC in the basement of the Moore School of Engineering at Penn, and it was not a practical computer, but they got a contract with the Census Bureau to build a commercial computer that would actually be used for tabulating the census, so they used this funding to make a company. They left Penn. And they started their own spin-off company using Census Bureau funds, and they built and delivered in 1951 the world's first commercial computer, the UNIVAC 1. And by that time, the Eckert Mauchly had been bought by Remington Rand. And so this is all getting complicated. So in the beginning, there was the census. The census begat the Hollerith Tabulating Machine Company, which merged with a couple of other companies to make the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, and that became renamed the International Business Machines Corporation. Then the census begat the Powers Accounting Machine Company, which merged with two other companies to become Remington Rand, and then the census provided the funds for the Eckert Mauchly startup, which created UNIVAC, which was bought by Remington Rand. So that's what happened. Okay, but we're not done. Now we go on to Fosdick. So by 1950, the tabulation problem was basically solved. The machinery was really fast, it was good, but it created a new bottleneck. And the new bottleneck was the punch card. The population and housing components of the 1950 census required about 22 gigabytes of data storage. They were stored on 282 million 80-column cards weighing 600 tons that, if piled up, would make a stack 31 miles tall. They were drowning in punch cards. And managing these things, they're fragile, they're terrible, they're just a terrible storage medium, and that was all there was. So the 1960 census was the first computerized census. I know we had the 1951, the UNIVAC there, and one in 1951. They really didn't do anything with it. It wasn't practical, and it came along too late anyway. They had all those fast IBM tabulators. They did the work on those. And so they had this computerized thing, and that offered a potential solution to the punch card problem. So in 1952, the Census Bureau machine shop began working on the film. This is an interesting thing. They just took that computer and they put it in exactly the same room. I showed you this picture before, tabulating the 1940 census. It's the same room. They just took out all the unit record machines and threw in the big computer. But anyway, so in 1952, the Census Bureau began working on this machine, the film optical sensing device for input to computers. This is the first high-speed optical mark recognition system. And the way it worked was this: you had bubble sheets. The enumerators would transfer their information. They'd go around from house to house picking up the census forms. They would transfer them then to these bubble sheets. Here's a zoom in, clothes washing machine, Ringer or Springer, spinner, whatever. And so in some ways this is like going back to 1790. We're decentralizing the data entry, right? But anyway, then you microfilm the bubble sheets and feed them through the Fosdick machine, and they go onto magnetic tape, and you never have a punch card. And so it was an amazing machine. It was a marvel, and it was used for every census from 1960 to 1990. In 1970, there was an additional innovation that you could tell here. You should see the little bubble being filled in there with the number 2 pencil. What happened in 1970 is they moved the data entry task to the public. The people were supposed to fill out their own bubble sheets. And then they received these forms by mail, and they sent them back by mail. So it was mail in, mail back, and in 1960 it had been mail out but picked up by the enumerator. So this is an envelope for doing that, and they had made a whole bunch of improvements to Fosdick, and they also invented this automatic sheet turning machine. And I wish I had the movie. I've seen a movie, and I want to get a hold of it, that shows this. It's a real Rube Goldberg device. You see there's a little brush there, and it's like all this stuff going on. And but anyway, and you can see that guy looks like he's from 1970. 1980, more of the same. Just better equipment. And 1990. By 1990, the Fosdick machine was really half computer. Many of the mechanical elements were gone. It was much more of an electronic rather than a mechanical device as it had been early on. So, but it was about 80 times faster than the original 1960 machine. It was super fast. Okay, so now we get to privatization. So for most of the 20th century, the federal government was expanding the scope of its activities. And after the war, you had the New Deal and then interstate highway system. You had all these investments in health and education and the Great Society and so on and so forth. And so this privatization, this expansion of government came under attack, especially beginning in the 1980s. Reagan thought that the private sector was inherently more efficient than the public sector, and he campaigned to privatize government functions. In his first inaugural address, Reagan said, government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. So the Reagan administration defined privatization as a strategy to shift the production of goods and services from the government to the private sector, to reduce government expenditures, to take advantages of the marvelous efficiencies of the marketplace. There was he didn't get that far. There was a Democratic majority in both houses at the time, and so he was Reagan's privatization effort had limited effect. President Clinton had a far bigger impact. He campaigned in 1992 on a third-way platform of shrinking the federal bureaucracy. And so with the support of Congress, every department in the executive branch began a rapid program of outsourcing. Hundreds of thousands of jobs formerly performed by federal employees began being performed by Beltway contractors. So this is executive branch employment per million population from 1975 to 2014. And you can see, there was a little decline in the Clinton administration and the early Reagan years, but then it kind of leveled off in the second half of the Reagan administration and the Bush administration. But then as soon as Clinton gets elected, it's a massive decline, a 30% decline in federal employment. So since the census, the Clinton era, there hasn't been too much change except for a little bump up during the Great Recession. As planning for the 2000 census ramped up in the early 1990s, there was a lot of pressure to identify what functions of the census could be outsourced. So they basically outsourced all of the data capture operations. In 1996, they closed the census machine shop that had been opened in 1906 and reassigned the engineers mostly to work on contracts. So they didn't use FOSDIC. They used the Data Capture System 2000, which was built by Lockheed Martin. There were a dozen centers around the country which had these Kodak digital science document scanners in them, and they were managed by another defense contractor, TRW. The scanners were not only about 30 times slower than the FOSDIC machine, but they also made a lot more errors. They didn't begin testing the imaging systems until 1998, and it immediately became clear that it just wasn't working. The whole system didn't work. The software development was much slower than they anticipated. A lot of milestones were missed. In February 2000, just 2 months before data capture was going to begin, the General Accounting Office found that there were still 120 crucial defects in the software and hardware. And even more troubling, the number of known critical problems actually had been going up over the previous 6 months. And so it was down to the wire. They did manage to get the system to work adequately at the last minute. The cost was vastly higher than anticipated, about $500 million for Lockheed Martin alone, which was 5 times of what they had originally bid. So, but data capture went smoothly in Census 2000 compared with 2010. Now, to move back here, sampling began in the census in 1940. They started moving at first some of the questions to a sample line, and then they started in 1960, they asked 25% of the population to fill out a long form, and the proportion of the population filling out long form gradually declined. But the long form was eliminated entirely in 2010, and that part of the census was moved to the American Community Survey. And so in 2010, we only had a short form. There were only 9 questions. But there were major technology failures. Representative Waxman said, "Let me be blunt, this is a colossal failure." Census 2010 had the most expensive software development failure in history. GAO issued 9 warnings in particular about the high risk posed by this device. This was a handheld personal digital assistant with GPS that we're supposed to use for non-response follow-up and for address verification. It was supposed to be done for $600 million. This machine is actually, it's still proudly displayed in a display case in Census headquarters, where they've got all bits of the Hollerith machine and bits of the Fosdick machine and stuff like that. And they proudly display this as their latest technological marvel, even though it was such a disaster. So the Census Bureau didn't have adequate oversight of the contractor, according to the GAO, and in 2008 the program was just canceled. And this was a windfall for Lockheed, which got an extra $2.5 billion because the Census Bureau reverted to paper forms at the last minute, meaning that everything, they thought that this would be direct to digital, and they had to go back through the paper forms. And well, the other reason why, oh yeah, in Brazil, they didn't have a trouble with this. They did it for $42 million. And then they did the 2010 census, worked out just fine. The other big failure in 2010 was the internet response option. There was an internet response option in 2000. Only 42,000 people took advantage of it. It wasn't very well publicized, but it did work. And it was going to be the major thing for 2010. This is the 2005 National Census Test. It seemed like it was going well, but then the Census Director McKinnon was worried about phishing, and so he canceled the program in 2005. And the reason why, but the biggest reason was that the contractor couldn't get the website working in time and functional in time for the 2008 dress rehearsal, and so they thought that it wouldn't be tested, and so they couldn't be confident of it, and so they just canceled it. So that all went to paper as well.
But didn't they start the American Community Survey
Yeah.
in between around that time?
I think it.
I got it. I got both. I got
Yeah.
one in New Jersey and in New York. I got.
I'm not sure what year ACS went to being started the internet response
They
option.
threatened to send me papers. So
But I
answered online.
But anyway, Canada, of course, they started internet response option in 2001. By 2011, they were old hands. Many other countries. In 2011, they had 54% of Canadian responses through the internet, saving gobs of money. Okay. On the left is the traditional cost metric for the decennial censuses. So this is the cost per housing unit, basically, and in 2010 dollars. And you can see actually the cost per housing unit actually went down between 1940 and 1960. That's partly due to sampling. There's a little bit of sampling in 1940, but not much. Most people answered most questions. But it also, I think, reflects the Fosdick machine and efficiencies in data capture. And then costs started going up, and they started really accelerating in 1980. You could see, though, the huge jump in 2000 when it almost doubled, and another jump in 2010. Over on the right, I've done it cost per item of information collected. So that's the population multiplied by the number of questions they asked, and depending on the sample density of the long form and whatnot, that varies over time. So by this metric, you can see just what a disaster 2010 was, because it was just it used to be that half the cost of collecting the census was the long form. They got rid of the long form, and the price still went up. And so if you calculate in terms of cost per item of information gathered, it was a disaster. So 2020, well, there are challenges. They again are doing internet response option and handheld devices for non-response follow-up. Technology is not ready. This is just the most recent of dozens of GAO reports that have come out already, and they consider the 2020 census to be a very high risk. They say at this time, the Bureau has not achieved the level of institutional maturity needed to reliably bring these solutions to bear. The Bureau lacks well-established IT management and security controls. A high degree of risk and uncertainty exists. And there's many, many headlines from the Beltway press about just what a potential disaster is in the offing. So this is without even considering the impact of the citizenship question. Could this be another healthcare.gov? Okay. Well, last week I had this guy email me on Monday who had read our working paper, and he was a longtime Census Bureau employee, and he said he's got the dirt. We then interviewed him last Friday, so just a couple of days ago, he described some pretty hostile. It was a hostile time when they closed down the machine shop and decided to privatize. This was it sounds terrible. We're going to try to follow up and see if we can get some more verification of this from other sources before we publish some of this stuff. But he did speak of actual. He says near violent when we interviewed him. Well, I guess it sometimes was violent. So, at any rate, this is an intriguing new thing. And now, though, we have a whole bunch of, I usually don't do a period of history where you can, like, go talk to the people. And I think that's so cool. So, anyway, we will be pursuing this. Here's my conclusions. From the late 19th century to the late 20th century, the U.S. was the world leader in the development of large-scale data capture and information processing technology in general. These had numerous spin-offs. Among other things, digital street maps, which, of course, ended up transforming all our lives. They were the ones who made the first base maps and created the technology to do that. So the Census Bureau lost this leadership position in the 1990s when political pressure led to privatization. And it was not, I don't think it was ever even really intended as a cost-saving measure. They used that rhetoric at the time, but they must have known that it was going to cost much, much more money. It was really ideologically driven, not having to do with money. It created new risks that threatened the censuses at multiple times, and it is entirely possible, that Census 2020 could be a complete disaster. And now in the Census Bureau, there are hardly any computer programmers left. The technical and there's no engineers, basically. The technical expertise is gone, and they're dependent on military contractors for just about everything. So that is the end.